There are theories that are presented to the public in an attempt to run a story. The story is a combination of truth and mystery. The story is then captured and circulated. Some of these stories die quick. They don't take off. Then, every once in a while, one does. The reason these theories stick around is because of that mystery. The question, what if? Now, what if, once upon a time, some people caught wind of an idea? Not a new idea, but one that was rebooted. Some people used this idea as a way to simply troll others. Some people took it seriously and started to investigate. This is what we know to be the flat earth theory. As a result, dozens of related theories have emerged, and societies have been formed around these theories. One of the theories to come out of this is the mud flood theory. So let's take a closer look at this theory. Tartaria, the flooding, the theory of cover-up, and what this means about the world we live in today. I guess the past doesn't always stay buried, but the truth does when it's buried in lies, or in this case, mud. So, for a while now, people have been asking me to cover the mud flood theory. And at first, I wasn't sure what people were referring to, as I thought maybe people were referring to the Great Flood of Noah. Turns out that is not the case. Unfortunately, I'm a little too late, as this theory is now several theories. But we will try to stick to the mainstream theory because so many people have gotten their hands on this, and the theory is now all over the place. You know, when you have someone in a society writing and publishing a book under 40 pages about the God of the Bible being a proxy and raging narc, you wonder what the point of that was, and you wonder what the point of this is. But I am not here to focus on the influencers. Let us actually consider this theory of the mud flood. Apparently, at some point in the past, say sometime during the late 18th or 19th century. Some say 17th century, some people say around 1,000 years ago. They don't really know. But at some point within that massive time frame, there was an event, a global event of which they don't know when it happened. One which caused towns and cities around the world to have heavy flooding, causing massive landslides or mud flooding. As a result, many lives were lost, leading to a global reset and cover-up to bring forward a new narrative for the world that existed prior to the mud flood. So once again, we have another theory or concept that seems to take its inspiration from Orwell and The Matrix. But is it wrong? Now, depending on who you ask, this theory tends to vary slightly, which is to be expected. But the main idea here is that there is a conspiracy to hide part, if not all, of our true history. How many of you guys have seen the movie Back to the Future? We understand the idea in that franchise was when you go back and change the past, you affect the present and future, leading you to ultimately alter the ancient past. Listen, I agree that our history is all over the place. It should be one solid story, but it's not. We actually live in a world with multiple histories, legends, mythologies, theories, documents of historical events, multiple. How do you have multiple religions without multiple narratives? I want to show you something. This is a photograph of the Boulevard du Temple in 1838. It is known as the first photograph to include people. Now, this is a busy section of town with many people in the shot. But because the exposure time was so long, I believe it was over a minute long exposure, anyone moving in the shot wouldn't be captured by the camera unless they were very still, like the one individual getting their shoes shined. The process of photography was evolving all through the 1800s into the late 1800s, and it didn't become available to the mass public until around 1900. So what does this mean? It means that any old photograph used to show the aftermath of the mud flood can be no older than the late 1830s. Before that, you are depending on drawings and paintings, lithographs, nothing written. And it would be strange to get rid of all of the written evidence, but not the visual. The reason I brought this photo up is because there are individuals who can't understand why there are very little to no people in many of these old photos. There are a few recordings of flooding in the 18th century, but in the 1800s, the 19th century, there was a flooded river in Maine in 1806, and more flooding in Maine up until 1832. There was the Great Flood of 1844, where the Missouri and Mississippi rivers flooded. There was a flood in 1847 that hit Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, and Virginia. New Orleans gets flooded in 1849. Then you have the Red River South Flood. Iowa and Nebraska got hit in 1851. You have a Northeast Flood in 1852. The Great Flood of 1862 that hit Oregon, Nevada, and California. The East Coast got hit again in 1869. D.C. and Philadelphia were hit. Omaha, Nebraska, Iowa got hit with the Great Flood of April in 1881. Ohio, West Virginia got hit with the Ohio River Flood in 1884. And the East Texas flood occurred that year. You have Michigan and California flooding in the early 1900s, the Great Flood of 1913. More than a dozen states were affected by this. There was a Great Flood in 1927, 1951, 1993, and many, many floods in between. So was all that flooding over the years, is that the mud flood, or did that happen before those floods? Or did it happen sometime during all those floods? This is throughout the 18 and 1900s, just in the US alone. So you can imagine the number of recorded floodings around the world during that time period. The mud flood was a single global event. So you cannot use photographs or videos of the aftermath of regional flooding recorded in sometimes different decades as any type of evidence of a single global flood, which, by the way, was promised never to happen again, if you are a Bible reader, and if you believe what was written there. Part of the mud flood theory is that Tartaria was the great world empire before the mud flood. Tartarus is the ancient Greek realm of the underworld, a place of suffering and torment for the wicked. This is a European concept, and Central Asia was labeled Tartaria because of the Tartars, who were the Mongol conquerors that they thought of as a threat to their civilization. Kind of like how people viewed the Vikings or Moors. They were very alienated, and Tartaria was only officially recognized on old maps as a place where these people roamed. And as newer maps were created, it got smaller and smaller, and it was known as Central Asia. Not all of Asia. Countries still had their borders. Without Tartars, you have no Tartaria, which means you no longer have to put it on the map. China wanted to be China, and Russia wanted to be Russia. Do you see? The borders were not as defined as today, but now, because we have these defined borders, Tartaria is gone because it was really just an idea placed on a map, which was a common thing to do in those days. Tartaria can be found on dozens of old printed maps and was nothing more than an idea of Central Asia in the minds of people during that time if you have an understanding of cartography and how they made money printing maps. It was not removed from maps because it was flooded away. But it doesn't matter because the mud flood was global, right? Therefore, this is not the only place that was affected, so it should not be the only change on a world map. And it isn't. Why? Because the names of places on world maps change. Not normally as a result of a cataclysmic event. Remember, back then they were making and printing maps based on books, not based on actual measurements. They didn't really get serious about that until the 1700s. That's why from the 1500s to the 1700s, you have a lot of maps that look weird, sometimes with mythical creatures placed on them. Some believe Tartaria was a place of advanced technology, and we are re-engineering what they left behind. If a site is affected by a mud flood, let's keep this in mind. This event was big enough to kill off so much of the world population that there was a reset. Yet the buildings people are showing in old photographs dug out of the mud were perfectly preserved, that they look almost new. But for some reason, they didn't clean up all the mud and left some surrounding the foundation, and they just covered what remained in asphalt and concrete. You know, in the 18th century, it was a common practice to build down, meaning they would dig further into the foundation of a building or house and move the dirt forward onto the street. This would give more space between the bottom of the ground floor doorway entrance so that a concrete staircase could be added. So that way, instead of walking straight into the doorway, you would walk up the staircase to the doorway, which gave the building a little more class. The extra dirt would become part of the raised street, which you see a lot of in Europe, where they just build layers over streets. There are some places where they have built so many layers of street that the ground levels of houses and or buildings become lower than the street. If you use the scientific method, there are steps to how a theory works. First, you define the event or phenomenon that you want to explain. Then you collect information about this phenomenon, but by going out and making observations, or you experiment. After collecting a lot of information, if you find patterns, you can form a hypothesis. You test the hypothesis and collect more data to see if the hypothesis continues to show this pattern. But if the data doesn't support the hypothesis, you have to reject it and come up with a better one. You cannot ignore data that contradicts the hypothesis in favor of data that supports it. Now, if the edited hypothesis is able to survive being debunked, then it becomes a theory. Once you have a theory, it can still be modified or rejected completely if there is enough evidence to disprove it. And a new, better theory must be created. But guess what? And I don't know if many of you know this, but the scientific method does not apply to earth science. The reason being, most of what the earth does cannot be replicated in a lab. And what happens to the earth geologically is too big to replicate. So you have to go out, take your observations, and work backwards to figure out what happened over time. Without a written record of some sort, your guess is as good as mine, because you would have to have observed the event when it comes to the earth. There are true cover-ups out there about history. They have tried and have altered parts of it. But theories like the mud flood go beyond comprehension because no one can actually explain the mud flood event. How could this happen almost everywhere at once? It is hard to comprehend because you need a certain element to make it work better. And this global mud flood really only works on a planet that is a different shape than a sphere. And it really works well with the Mandela effect. So what are we talking about here? Is this a lure to get people to buy into the flat or infinite plane Earth movement from a different angle? I look into these subjects and I keep it moving. Why? Because how do some of these things that are discussed affect your life? How does the Mothman affect your life, folks? How do giants and giant ancient tree stumps affect your life today? Do these things truly reinforce your beliefs, or do they just entertain your beliefs? Of course, these things are always fun to discuss, but they do eventually become boring and redundant when questions cannot be answered. It is good to ask questions and fun to entertain the many theories we discuss, but don't be a fool. There is plenty more to come. This year is about to get hot, so stay tuned. Until next time, be sure to visit woodwardentertainment.com and the Woodward Entertainment Store. And as always, friends, stay awake, stay aware, stay safe, and I'll talk to you all soon.